Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets by J.K. Rowling. At Flourish and Blotts. Life at the Burrow was different as possible from life in Private Drive. The Dursleys liked everything neat and ordered. The Weasleys' house burst with the strange and unexpected. Harry's got a shock the first time he looked in the mirror over the kitchen mantelpiece, and it shouted, "Tuck your shit in, Scuffy!" The girl in the attic howled and drooped pipes whenever he felt things were getting too quiet, and small explosions from Fred and George's bedroom were considered perfectly normal. What Harry found was almost unusual about life at Ron's, however, wasn't like the talking mirror or the clanking ghoul. It was the fact that everybody there seemed to like him. Mrs. Weasley fussed over the state to his socks and tried to force him to eat 4 helpings at every meal. Mr. Weasley liked Harry to sit next to him at the dinner table so that he could bombard him with questions about life with muggles, asking him to explain how things like plugs and postal service worked. "Fascinating," he would say as Harry talked him through using a telephone. "Intelligence? Really, how many ways muggles have found of getting along without magic?" Harry heard from Hogwarts one sunny morning about a week after he had arrived at the Burrow. He and Ron went down to breakfast to find Mr. and Mrs. Weasley and Ginny already sitting at the kitchen table. The moment that she saw Harry, Ginny accidentally knocked her porridge bowl to the floor with a loud clatter. Ginny seemed very prone to knocking things over whenever Harry entered the room. She dived under the table to retrieve the bowl and emerged with her face glowing like setting sun. Pretending he hadn't noticed this, Harry sat down and took the toast Mrs. Weasley offered him. "Letters from school," said Mr. Weasley, passing Harry and Ron in identical envelopes of yellowish parchment and dressed in green ink. "Dumbledore already knows you here, Harry. Doesn't Mrs. Trick, that man? You two got them at 2, he added as Fred and George ambled in, still in their pajamas. For a few minutes there was only silence as they all read their letters. Harry told him to catch the Hogwarts Express as usual from King's Cross Station on September the 1st. There was also a list of the new books he'd need for the coming year. Second-year students will require The Standard Book of Spells, Grade 2, by Miranda Goshawk, Break with a Banshee by Gilderoy Lockhart, Getting with Ghouls by Gilderoy Lockhart, Holidays with Hags by Gilderoy Lockhart, Traveling with Trolls by Gilderoy Lockhart, Voyage with Vampires by Gilderoy Lockhart, Wandering with Werewolves by Gilderoy Lockhart, Year with a Yeti by Gilderoy Lockhart. Fred, who had finished his own list, peered over at Harry's. "You've been told to get all the Lockhart's books too," he said. "The new Defense Against the Arts teacher must be a fan. Bet it's a witch." At this point, Fred caught his mother's eyes and quickly bussed himself with a marmalade. "That lot won't come cheap," said George, with a quick look at his parents. "Lockhart's books are really expensive." "Well, we'll manage," said Mrs. Weasley, but she looked worried. "I expect we'll be able to pick up a lot of Ginny's things secondhand." "Oh, are you studying Hogwarts this year?" Harry asked Ginny. She nodded, blushing to the roots of her flaming hair, and put her elbow in the butter dish. Fortunately, no one saw this except Harry, because just then Ron's elder brother Percy walked in. He was already dressed, his Hogwarts prefect badge pinned to his knitted tank top. "Morning all," said Percy briskly. "Lovely day." He sat down in the only remaining chair, but leaped up against almost immediately, pulling from underneath him a molting grey feather duster. At least, that was what Harry thought it was until he saw that it was breathing. "Avril," said Ron, taking the limp towel from Percy and extending a letter from underneath its wing. "Finally! He's got Hermione's answer. I wrote her saying we were going to try and rescue you from the Dursleys." He carried Avril to her perch just inside the back door and tried to stand on it, but Avril flopped straight off again, so Ron laid him on the draining board instead, muttering, "Pathetic." Then he ripped open Hermione's letter and read it out loud. "Dear Ron and Harry, if you're there, I hope everything went all right and that Harry is okay and that you didn't do anything illegal to get him out, Ron, because that would get Harry into trouble too. I've been really worried, and if Harry is all right, will you please let me know at once? But perhaps it should be better if you used a different owl, because I think another delivery might finish your own off. I'm very busy with school of work, of course." "How can she be?" said Ron in horror. "We're on holiday." and we're going to London next Wednesday to buy my new books. Why don't we meet at Diagon Alley? Let me know what's happening as soon as you can. Love from Hermione. Well, that fits is nicely. We can go and get all your things then too, says Mrs. Weasley, starting to clear the table. What are you all up today? Harry, Ron, Fred, and George were planning to go up the hill to a small padlock the Weasleys owned. It was surrounded by trees that blocked it from the view of village below, meaning that they could practice Quidditch there, as long as they didn't fly too high. They couldn't use real Quidditch balls, which would have been hard to explain if they had escaped and flown away over the village. Instead, they threw apples for each other to catch. They took it in turns to ride Harry's Nimbus 2000, which was easily the best broom. Ron's old shooting star was often outstripped by passing butterflies. 5 minutes later, they were marching up the hill, broomsticks over their shoulders. They had asked Percy if he wanted to join them, but he had said he was busy. Harry had only seen Percy at meal times so far. He stayed shut in his room the rest of the time. I wish I knew what he was up to, said Fred, frowning. He's not himself. His exam results came the day before you did. 12. Owl is the hardly glotted at all. Ordinary wizarding levels, George explained, seeing Harry's puzzled look. Bill got 12 too. If we're not careful, we'll have another head boy in the family. I don't think I could stand the shame. Bill was the oldest Weasley brother. He and the next brother, Charlie, had already left Hogwarts. They had never met either of them, but knew that Charlie was in Romania, studying dragons, and Bill in Egypt, working for the Wizards' Bank, Gringotts. Do you know how Mom and Dad are going to afford all our school stuff this year? Said George after a while. 5 sets of Lockhart books, and Ginny needs ropes and a wand and everything. Harry said nothing. He felt a bit awkward. Stored in an underground vault at Gringotts in London was a small fortune that his parents had left him. Of course, it was only the Wizarding World that had money. You couldn't use galleons, sickles, and nuts in Muggle shops. He had never mentioned his Gringotts bank account to the Dursleys. He didn't think their horror of anything connected with magic would stretch to a large pile of gold. Mrs. Weasley woke them all early the following Wednesday. After a quick half-a-dozen bacon sandwiches, they pulled on their coats and Mrs. Weasley took a flower pot off the kitchen mantelpiece and peered inside. "We're running, Arthur," she sighed. "We'll have to buy some more today. Well, guests first. After you, Harry dear." And she offered him the flower pot. Harry stared at them, watching him. "What am I supposed to do?" he stammered. "He's never traveled by flue powder," said Ron suddenly. "Sorry, Harry, I forgot." "Never?" said Mr. Weasley. "But how did you get to Diagon Alley to buy your school things last year?" "I went on the underground." "Really?" said Mr. Weasley eagerly. "Were there escalators?" "How exactly?" "Not now, Arthur," said Mrs. Weasley. "Flue powder's a lot quicker, dear, but goodness me, if you never used it before." "He'll be all right, Mom," said Fred. "Harry watches first." He took a pinch of glittering powder out of the flower pot, stepped up to the fire, and threw the powder into the flames. With a roar, the fire turned emerald green and rose higher than Fred, who stepped right into it, shouted "Diagon Alley," and vanished. "You must speak clearly, dear," Mrs. Weasley told Harry as George dipped his hand into the flower pot. "And mind you get out at the right grade." "The right what?" said Harry nervously, as the fire roared and whipped George out of sight too. "Well, there are an awful lot of wizards' fires to choose from, you know. But as long as you've spoken clearly, he'll be fine, Molly, don't fuss," said Mr. Weasley, helping himself to flue powder too. "But dear, if he got lost, how could we ever explain this to his aunt and uncle? They wouldn't mind," Harry reassured her. "Dudley would think it was a brilliant joke if I got lost up a chimney. Don't worry about that." "Well, all right, you could have to after," said Mrs. Weasley. "Now, when you get into the fire, say where you're going. And then keep your elbows tucked in," Ron advised. "And your eyes shut," said Mrs. Weasley. "Don't fidget," said Ron, "or you might well fall out of the wrong fireplace. But don't panic and get too early. Wait until you see Fred and George." Trying hard to bear all this in his mind, Harry took a pinch of flue powder and walked to the edge of the fire. He took a deep breath, scattered the powder into the flames, and stepped forward. The fire felt like a warm breeze. He opened his mouth and immediately swallowed a lot of hot ash. "The diagonally," he coughed. It felt as though he was being stuck down a giant plug hole. He seemed to be spinning very fast. The roaring in his ears was defeating. He tried to keep his eyes open, but the whirl of green flames made him feel sick. Something hard knocked his elbow, and he tucked in slightly, still spinning and spinning. Now it felt as though cold hands were slapping his face. Squinting through his glasses, he saw a blurred stream of fireplaces and snatched glimpses of the room beyond.